having some issues with my cameras. Um, I don't know if I'm wearing down the data card or something like that, but here's camera number 2. See if we can get that working out okay. So I'm telling you about the population growth, which is a manifestation, of course, of the dynamic growth of America in the antebellum period. So we see the population growing rapidly, of course. It's the same old story basically as far as the colonial period, with the one big exception, and that is that we do have the northern urban middle class beginning to transform themselves. And the major point that I was really interested in making, of course, was that it's liberating for women. Northern urban middle class women were liberated by this, able to become more publicly active and actually begin to promote the notion of women's rights, of course, and even women's suffrage. I think that's both great, but also there's a tragedy here in that by the 1840s they are arguing for the women's right to vote, and yet it won't become reality until 1920. So that means that the women of that era who were promoting that, they're probably going to be dead. And Susan B. Anthony lived a super long life. She lived, I think, till 1908, if I'm not mistaken. And she couldn't live long enough. She could live long enough to see women voting in individual states. By the time we get to the early part of the 20th century and the progressive era, some states were recognizing the right of women. But the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, doesn't come until 1920. So it's almost like the grandchildren of those first women, are the ones who will finally get to vote, essentially. So natural increase is a powerful factor in terms of the rapid population growth of America in the antebellum period. The other thing, if you guys remember, of course, is it's always going to be immigration. Immigration for any defined area as far as the world is concerned, 2 ways the population can grow: through either natural increase or through migration or immigration in this case. And in this moment, immigration becomes sort of more of an important story that I want to highlight for you, because quite a dramatic component, of course, of what's happening relative to the antebellum period. So one thing that's interesting, and first of all, immigration is a constant in American history. I'm sure you guys know that. It is both the boon of our society and to some degree the bane. I would have to say, of course, it has so much more been the benefit of America. We are a nation that's made up of these risk takers who are willing to risk their lives, of course, to come across the Atlantic Ocean or Pacific Ocean to come to our country, bringing their skills, their talents, their excuse me. I have kind of been doing this nonstop, and I think I'm kind of wearing out my voice, so I'm not going to go too much longer today. But bringing their skills, their talents, their abilities, and then the thing that I always appreciate, they'll bring their food. Yay! Thank you for all your cool food. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. Okay. Anyway, so immigration is this constant, and it's this weird thing, of course, that we are a nation of immigrants who have a really hard time with immigrants, and it doesn't make much sense, but it is kind of the way that it works here, unfortunately. So. One thing that's interesting is that there are times when there aren't as many immigrants. It's very uncommon, but there are times when that happens. And one period where this is kind of going on is from like the Revolutionary period until about the 1830s. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, the breakup between the Americans, of course, and the British, that I think would inhibit it to some degree. Much more important, though, are simply the era of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. This is a time when there's a tremendous amount of chaos, there's a tremendous amount of warfare, and to try to travel on the high seas, you are often putting yourself in significant risk. So we don't see a tremendous amount of immigration to America, from kind of the end of the Revolutionary period until we get into the 1830s. But then in the 1830s, things seem to change. And so these statistics I'm about to give you are decade numbers. And we see that in the 1830s, we're looking at about 60,000 immigrants that came that year. Now, I have to tell you, at that moment, that would be almost unnoticeable. You divide it down, we're looking, 60,000 people in a year. There's 12, divide that by 12, I don't know, a few thousand a month or something like that. And then if you did it by the daily basis, you're looking at relatively few people at all. So, there weren't that many people coming, and I don't even think there's anything that would be noticed here. And the only reason we do notice it is because we see what kind of builds from that particular point. So the 1830s, there seems to be a trickle of an increase as far as immigration is concerned. In the 1840s, it increases dramatically as we have 1.7 million immigrants coming to America. And then by the 1850s, the explosion continues with 2.2 million. And understand that we're still looking at less than 170,000 a month in terms of, a year in the 1840s, and less than 220,000 a month in terms, a year, excuse me, I keep doing that wrong, a year in terms of, looking backwards at this is messing me up. So in the 1830s, we're looking at about 6,000 a year, right? 6,000 a year, and then you can do that by month, and you see that's not many. 1840s, we're looking closer to, of course, 170,000 per year. That was noticeable. I want you to know it was noticeable. 1850s, 220,000 per year. That clearly was noticeable. In fact, enough immigrants are coming in America that you actually have kind of a reaction to this. And there's a lot of people going, oh no, there's too many immigrants. A rise of anti-foreign feelings, a rise of so-called xenophobia, which I will suggest to you to some degree. Now the question is, what's happening? All of a sudden there's an uptick that seems to be occurring, and of course a noticeable uptick that even the people of the era would see. So what's happening is this very large phenomenon that we call the Atlantic migration. The Atlantic migration. The Atlantic migration is kind of a representation of the fact that in the 19th century the Europeans are becoming kind of the dominant entity as far as the world is concerned. Their population was burgeoning, their countries were becoming industrialized and more powerful. They will ultimately assert themselves through imperialism. But you kind of have an explosion of Europeans out of Europe. And of course it has to wait till after the Napoleonic period is over, kind of, and we just create this era of European migration, which runs, the historians who study this want to make this a 100-year phenomenon, so from 1830 to 1930. Now, I have to tell you, I think most of it's occurring between 1830 and really 1914, when World War I comes along to really inhibit kind of that mobility. But it's fine to make it this longer period of time. During that period, and it's awkward how it's on the card, but 65 million Europeans will move out of Europe. This is the essential expression of the Atlantic migration. For a long time, that was considered to be the largest mass movement of human beings in the history of the world. Never before had so many people moved all at one time. But I do want you to know that that has been surpassed in recent decades by the internal dynamics of China. Within China over the last, I'm not sure how long it's been, let's say 30 years, over 100 million Chinese have moved from the countryside to the city. So it's interesting how China can create like a world record within itself, without even having to anyone to go anywhere outside of China. You guys have any sense of it? But when the Chinese try to go home for holidays, it's like this mass movement of people, train stations, airports, everybody trying to get home at the very same time. 100 million people, pretty impressive. But up until that time, the Atlantic migration was the greatest of migration. Now we have 65 million people who are on the move, and they're going everywhere, to be honest with you. But the number one destination of choice absolutely was the United States of America. That's where they're heading, okay? So 35 million, more than half of all of those that were involved in the Atlantic migration will ultimately go to the United States. I do need you to know that most of them are going after the Civil War. Look at our antebellum statistics, of course. We see the fact that we're only adding up to, under 4 million people. So of the 35 million, most of them will come after the Civil War. And to be honest with you, they're going to come after 1880. It's going to be a while after this. Civil War is kind of being inhibiting too, and then it takes a little while. And then finally in the 1880s, you really see the uptick, that begins to occur. So we're just seeing the beginning of the Atlantic migration. Don't put these big numbers into the whole story yet. They're going to have to wait a while. Remember, 35 million is more than the population of the entire United States in 1860. So that's the long story, and this is just the beginning of that story. Here comes the Atlantic migration. Now, the Atlantic migration has a number of interesting characteristics, and the one that I think I'm interested in is it's a mass movement of people. 65 million, damn impressive when you have 35 million going to the United States, and yet it's a very atomized activity. So it's not like a culture on the move or a nation on the move or something like that, the Mongolian horde moving or something like that. It's just individuals and admittedly families, people on their own who make this move, who make their own particular decisions and who make this particular move. I always like to tell you the story of just one of them. It's a little later in the Atlantic migration, but it was a young man, really a boy, named Otto, 16 years old, who lived in Småland, Sweden. I'm not exactly sure where that is. I think it's north of Stockholm. And he came from a rural agricultural situation, and he just didn't think there was a place for him in that. So without his parental permission, he decides to basically run away, goes to Stockholm, gets himself on a steamer to New York, makes his way out to Omaha, Nebraska, He marries another Swedish immigrant. Her name was Sarah. She was 14 years old when they got married, of course. Not uncommon at that time for them to do that. He became a carpenter and relatively successful. He built his own home located on, I can't remember the name of the street anymore. Not Hickory. That's my other grandmother. Both my mom and dad both grew up in Omaha, but had a son by the name of his name was Wilhelm, but they kind of changed that to William during World War I. And then William had a son named Tom, and Tom had a son named Chris. So my ancestor, Otto Johnson, as a 16-year-old individual, came to America. It's the kind of thing you would see repeated, of course, millions of times over the course of the Atlantic migration. So there's the atomized component to it, just individuals making their decision, of course, and coming on their way to the United States. Now, the people who came to America at this time, we often call them the inarticulate, historically inarticulate. And that means that we often don't know what they're doing. Why are you doing this? Immigration is such a profound statement. You're leaving your homeland and you're going somewhere else. You're taking a huge chance. You're taking a very big risk, of course, in doing this. And one of the things that's just as intriguing is that we don't always get to know exactly why they did this. And so, especially historically, what historians want to have happen is that anyone who comes to America ever as an immigrant needs to fill out a form. I'm coming from, my age is, the reason I'm doing it is because I hope to find, I'm hoping to see, all the aspirations of these individuals we want to know. Without those, though, we have to kind of theorize about why they came. So what has happened is that the historians have created kind of two general theses, two general ways of understanding why it is that the immigrants would come to America. And I'm going to present them to you. Now, the first, we will call this the American Thesis. So this is generated within America with an understanding, that this is how the Americans perceive immigration. And I'm going to call it the pull thesis, all right, the pull thesis. So the pull thesis, and this is fairly self-explanatory, but that immigrants come to America because they're pulled here, right? There's some magnetic quality about America, and I'm sure you guys can guess the kind of things that are part of that. There is open land in America. There is religious toleration in America. There is money in America. There are jobs in America. There's a relatively benign social apparatus, political apparatus, economic system. All these things are kind of things that not only attracted them, of course, in the 19th century, but continue to attract immigrants, I should say, even to this very day. So the critical issue is the Americans see that the primary motivating factor for immigration is that America is such a wonderful place. Of course they're going to want to come here, right? So this is called the pull thesis. It's the American perspective on why immigrants come to America. Now, intriguingly, the Europeans kind of object, and they have a counter argument which they present. And I'm going to call this the push thesis, because that's what we call it. That's what they would call it too. So this means that the most important thing that's happening, causing immigration is not, something that's pulling them away, but something that's happening within Europe. And it's kind of an ironic thing, both theses are kind of ethnocentric. The Americans want their perspective, the Europeans want theirs, But the European perspective in some ways is kind of a negative one, right? Something bad is happening in Europe that would motivate people to want to leave Europe. So, when we look at the push thesis, we try to understand what's going on. It's the exact opposite. So they're coming from a situation of religious intolerance or political persecution, a place where there isn't land, a place where there isn't jobs. There's political upheaval or something taking place where they're coming. So, and the Europeans, this is their perspective. What's most important is not what's happening in America. What's most important is what's happening in Europe. And you'll see, we're going to evaluate this in just a second. You'll see that they're not necessarily wrong here. Now, I like to be an ameliorator. So to be honest with you, I always think both things have to be going on. First of all, humans are maximizers, so they don't do things that are bad for them. I've never heard anyone tell me that they're going to move someplace because it's worse. I can't wait to get to so-and-so because that's a place where I'm not going to be able to find a job. No one does that, right? Every student who ever told me they were going someplace always said it would be better. This is going to be better than California, okay? I mean, that's the way that you're going to think. It may not be true, but that's the way that you're going to perceive it, all right? So you never leave some place unless there's a good reason to leave it, right? So clearly there must have been something that was pushing them. But you're not going to go someplace unless you think it's a good idea to go there. So to me, the correct thesis is sort of the push-pull thesis, right? It's a little bit something going on, where you live, of course, because that's not a good situation. I don't think anyone's going to leave a good situation and go to someplace if there's any uncertainty there, right? So there's something wrong with where they came from, and there's some notion that it's going to be better where they're going. So the two of them will come together. But I will let you know that as we look to the individual groups that are immigrating, we will see that one of these will kind of stand out. It will be a little more this, or it'll be a little more that kind of. Anyway, these theses actually are meaningful, so we have to be kind of aware of them, right? So what I want to do now is I want to tell you about the major immigrant groups to America in the antebellum period. And the number one group of people from point of destination that will come to America in the antebellum period, I'm going to give you just a second to guess. Who do you think the number one group of immigrants coming to America in the antebellum period was? And my hint to you is whiskey, Then we're going to say it out loud to the screen. And if you said Irish, of course, you are right. And the Irish become the #1 group of immigrants to America between 1845 and 1860. Some 1.7 million Irish will come to America, making them overwhelmingly the dominant group of immigrants who will come to the United States. And because they're critical and because they're the prominent group coming, the Irish will be a potential identification. Okay, so understand this is a potential identification for the final examination. So the question becomes, of course, well, who's right in terms of the theory? Are they coming because they're just drawn to America, or is there something else going on here? So just for fun, can you guess what is the dominant understanding of why the Irish came? And if you said the push thesis, then you're right. I mean, clearly the Europeans are not wrong in their assessment here. There was something going on in Ireland that would indeed become a push factor to push the Irish out of Ireland and have them coming to America. And the push factor that will lead to ultimately 1.7 million Irishmen coming to America was, can you tell me what really bad thing happened in Ireland in the 1840s? If you said potato famine, of course, you're absolutely right. So this is this horrific kind of moment that racks Ireland and causes, of course, all kinds of distress and death and mayhem, and ultimately leads to many, many Irish pretty much being forced to leave Ireland, having to go somewhere else just to kind of make it. Just a quick history on the potato famine. One thing that I always hope that everyone remembers is the origin of the potato. I told you all about this in the early part of our class when we were talking about the Native Americans and their agricultural revolutions. So the original place that the potato came from, one of the great agricultural revolutions of the New World area, remember that it was corn and stuff that they grew in Mexico. And the other place it came from was, and if you're saying generally Peru, Bolivia, okay, that's true, but I specifically told you it came from the shores of, please say it before I say it, Lake Titicaca. You guys remember Lake Titicaca? If you remember, I said Lake Titicaca quite a few times. I don't know why I say Lake Titicaca quite so often, but I tend to just like to say Lake Titicaca, and I've already said it, I think, 5 times so far, but I promise you I will not say Lake Titicaca again as far as our class goes, okay? But from the shores of Lake Titicaca, here came the potato. And the potato comes over to the Europe, and in certain areas it's really kind of, becomes important. It's important in Germany, and it's also very, very important in Ireland. The potato needs wet, acidic soils. And the soils of Ireland, it's called the Emerald Isle for a reason. It's beautifully green. I got to drive around there one time. I really loved it. It's very beautifully green. So it's a wet, acidic soil, which isn't always that good for grain. If the soil, if it doesn't dry out a little bit for grain, that's a problem. But the potato just loves it. It loves living in these acidic soils, of course, which kind of push its way out and create itself as a tuber. Anyway, the Irish will grab onto the potato, of course, and it becomes the sustaining grace of the large part of the Irish population. We actually have, because of the potato in Ireland, a population explosion. And I think, I'm pretty sure this is correct, that there were more Irish in Ireland before the potato famine than there are today. I mean, the population explodes. And the potato is just wonderful for the relatively land-poor Irish people with a fairly small area that, just these little plots they could have. They could stick all the potato plants in there, and they would give themselves enough potatoes to allow them to kind of to endure through the year, through the entire year. So now here's the problem, okay? The Irish basically just had one kind of potato, and that potato, of course, could be subject to problems, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So here's the story of the potato famine. We believe it was, we know it was caused by a fungus, and we believe the fungus originally originated in Mexico. So just as the coronavirus travels across the world, so can other things like that, right? Now, the potato, this fungus hit the potato crops. It went from Mexico to the United States of America, and we believe ultimately to Ireland. And of course, the intriguing thing is that there's no significant impact in Mexico, and of course, probably you can guess, the potato's not that important in Mexico. There was no significant impact in America because the Americans had a variety of different potatoes they could turn to, and the only place it's really going to do damage is indeed in Ireland. Probably came across, on a potato that came from the United States to Ireland. It comes to Ireland probably in the early part of the 1840s. It's going to take some while for it to do its own demographic increase. But by 1845, this fungus is exploding across. It's a pandemic as far as the potato are concerned. And the Irish first saw that the leaves of the potato look bad. They're turning black. And then they go down and dig up the tubers, and the tubers are black and mealy and unedible. They've been destroyed by the fungus, essentially. And almost overnight, Ireland becomes just a situation of huge desperation. There's so many sad things about Ireland. One of them is that there probably was food for everybody, but these are large English landholders who are taking their food, of course, and selling it someplace else. And those that were dependent upon the potato find themselves, in just a horrible situation. We believe that within, I'm not sure it's exactly a year, but somewhat over a year, over 1 million Irish will die in Ireland. Just this really horrific hit in terms of the potato famine. As you can imagine, there become so many stories, and many of them in America, of the famine Irish, all their suffering. And if you go to Dublin, there's like the famine Irish monument of these just skeletal beings that are kind of walking next to the river there. And there's another monument in Boston for the Irish famine, and you see on one side of like this little area, garden area, there's the really poor people of Ireland that are coming over, and then the other side is kind of robust Irish that are making their way in America. But you do see monuments to this situation. But there's a story that comes from Boston, and this guy lived into the 20th century, and he was well known in the Irish part of Boston, and he was known for being very short. He was shorter than usual, and for having a very strange gait. So when he walked, he had just walked in a very kind of peculiar sort of way. And he had a story to tell, and of course, he was the kind of guy who would tell it to you if you just, if you want to hear it, if you want to buy him a glass of beer. So the story is that he was a young kid in Ireland during the famine, and his mother thought he died. She thought he died, and he's, looks like he's dead. And so the mother, of course, probably having to deal with a lot of other children, a lot of other issues, was trying to get him buried if she possibly could. And she brings the coffin maker in, and the coffin maker brings the coffin that he already had, for a child. And the problem was that the boy was just a little too long for the coffin. And the mother's like, what do I do? What do I do? And the coffin maker, the undertaker, trying to be helpful, to say, well, I can break his bones, I can break his legs, we can fit him in. And I think the mother, thinking the boy is dead, of course, and thinking there's nothing else you could do about it, so gave the okay to it. And so the coffin maker is breaking the boy's legs, and of course, as he does, the boy starts to moan. He was comatose, but he wasn't quite dead. And of course, not only was he not dead then, he wouldn't be dead until the 20th century, but he will live with this enduring mark of, this moment, breaking his legs right below the growth plate there, kind of the lower part of the leg, and, inhibiting growth and development of the lower part of the leg. So, shorter than he should have been, with this strange gait that reflected, of course, these injuries that he'd endured. And I'm sure there's a million stories like that, babies with bloated stomachs, just kind of the horrors of Ireland at that time. Now, with no alternative, really, the only thing the Irish could do is come to the United States. I've already told you they start coming in 1845, and they'll continue to come up in 1860, about 1.7 million of them. Clearly, when they come, they're not coming because they wanted to, absolutely, and many of them were very sad that they would have to leave their Emerald Isle. But they come to America because they saw no potential alternative. As they came to the United States, they will become the first significant group of immigrants to be despised. This isn't, unfortunately, the last time this will happen, but it's the first time that happens in any kind of major way. And they were despised basically for two critical reasons. Of course, for their relative poverty, but maybe even more so for their Catholicism. This was perceived by, so many of the Americans were Protestants. They saw this as a papist invasion, of course, of America. All these Irish Catholics coming along, and there were many, many Americans very unhappy and glad. This creates a foundation of political movements, of course, or anti-Catholic, anti-Irish political organizations that begin to form themselves. As the Irish came in, and you'll see that I'm switching now to the cards that my wife made for me, they will be met with significant discrimination, to say the least. There's no doubt about that. A tremendous amount of overt hostility towards the Irish. You could see signs in the windows of the factories in the Northeast that said, "No Irish need apply." And I have to tell you, my bottom line there are some that say that that's apocryphal, that's just been created, but I'm not sure that it is absolutely. That there would be signs in saloons and taverns and restaurants that said, "No dogs nor Irishmen." So the dogs actually get top billing in that particular perspective. So clearly indications of discrimination. We find that the Irish are given the absolute worst jobs you can possibly have in America. So they're going to dig the canals. I'll tell you later about how important the canals were in terms of the economic growth of America. You find some of them down south, they're draining swamps. I found them down in Mississippi in the Delta area. I remember thinking to myself, what the hell are they doing down here? But there was a demand for their particular kind of labor. When you drain a swamp, it's a very dangerous thing. You're sending a human being into the swamp where, of course, mosquitoes are rife, where there might be water moccasins and what's the other kind of really poisonous substance? I can't remember right now. You know, snakes down there that could cause you difficulty. And you know, if a slave went into the swamp and died, then that's a huge loss to the slave owner. But if you send an Irishman in there, you're paying him like 50 cents a day. Well, if he dies, you just hire another one. You know, it's no big deal. No skin off your back whatsoever. So we see the Irish down south, they're joining the swamps. And then very famously, of course, we see them in